Bonjour, degenerate. Welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 315, Muhammad versus Della Maddalena. That's quite a mouthful. Live from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And, it's looking like an okay card. I'm going to be one of those people that is more excited for the women's championship than the men's championship this weekend, but the card is okay. Obviously, we lost a big one in the opener, Benoit Saint-Denis and Yoel Alvarez, and Alvarez has since been replaced with Prepolec. That sounded more Russian than French. Yeah, I'm a man of the world in name only, but in any event, I'm not gonna try to beat around the bush too much. We got 12 fights to get through. Had an excellent pay-per-view on the UFC 314 podcast. I would highly recommend going back and listening to that if you haven't already, just because only fight I missed was the Elkins-Arosa fight. And we were a couple up kicks away, I think, from Elkins making that one a little interesting. In spite of what anybody says about Elkins looking like he was washed or shouldn't be in there or shouldn't be allowed back in the cage or whatnot. In any event, thank you very much for tuning in. Please like, share, and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow on X if you haven't already. I believe since the last pay-per-view, I have eclipsed 2,000 followers on Twitter, so thank you very much for helping me build the platform up to what it's been, and I was able to do that. I started the account on the last day of May in 2022, so I was able to get it done before the end of April, but even before the within-month anniversary, within 3 years of founding the platform, we were able to cross that threshold. So 500 the first year, over 1,000 the second year, and I've doubled that now. 3 straight years. Not optimistic I'm going to get to 4,000 by this time next year, but baby steps, little by little. I'm proud of the growth that I've put together within these 3 years. And if you saw my post about it, like I said on the show or on the tweet, it's been all organic growth. So thank you to each and every one of you that have helped me build it up to this point. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about this a little bit. Like I said, card's not super great, but there's still some intriguing matchups on here, and hoping to build off the strong pay-per-view we had last time with another good one this weekend. So without further ado, we'll jump right into it. And as you are accustomed to at this point, the meme I say is always I'm going to try to be as brief as I can, and I said that last time, and then I ended up going for almost 3 hours. I started out pretty good, and then I got a little long-winded with some of the fights I was more excited about, but I think given the 12-fight card here and some not all compelling matchups, I should be able to breeze through a few of these. I believe I've got how many picks? Because there were a couple fights that I've at least put out stayaways on. I think I did at least 2. So I think I've got at least 10 picks for this card that I'll try to be a little bit more, is it 10 or 9? I think it might be 9 picks. In any event, I'm going to get through these, and I'm going to challenge myself to try to get it under 2 hours. We'll see how good I am at sticking to that, but that is at least my goal for this one, is to not get too long-winded on any of these. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we will start the evening off with Bekzat, Almakhan, and Brad Katona. Almakhan enters 11-2, has not fought since March of last year when he took a short notice booking with the most recent title challenger, Umar Nurmagomedov, on short notice. Very, very controversially, I shouldn't say controversially, but to the unexpected delight of many, was able to score an early knockdown on Umar in that fight, and still found a way to get 30-26 on at least one scorecard despite that. Conversely, Brad Katona enters 16-4. He went 1-2 in the UFC last year, most recently fought in October when he dropped a unanimous decision to the formerly undefeated John Matsumoto. Prior to that, might have gotten a short notice. I don't know if it was short notice, but I know he was very much expected to beat Jesse Butler and did so in unanimous decision fashion. All of Katona's fights have gone to unanimous decision. That also includes the last time he fought in Canada, which was UFC 297, Strickland versus Duplessis, where he lost to Garrett Armfield in a fight that, frankly, could have been scored either way. I picked Katona to win that one. I believe I even made him a parlay leg that night. Frankly, I was shocked that on a card where it seemed like a lot of Canadians got a little bit of element of hometown cooking. I know that Sean Woodson fought Charles Jourdain to a split decision that a lot of people thought should have been unanimous for Woodson. Marc-Andre Barriault also fought Chris Curtis in a split decision that a lot of people thought Curtis should have gotten in unanimous fashion too. So it was surprising that Katona didn't even managed to get a split against Armfield in a fight that a lot of people thought that he won. A lot of people thought that he beat Matsumoto as well. I picked Matsumoto in that fight card. That was Hernandez versus Pereira. That was the one last year where I was one off from a sweep, if not for Kyler Phillips. And I believe I made Matsumoto a leg that night. But in any event, Katona's fought a fairly decent strength of schedule. I think the Cody Gibson win on the Ultimate Fighter finale from almost a couple years ago now has aged decently well. Been in there with Merab Dvalishvili as well. And very famously up until Josh Emmett and John Silva recently was the only fighter to finish Bryce Mitchell, which I believe he did on his first time that he won the Ultimate Fighter back in 2018. I think he's got another good win under his belt against a UFC veteran, but the name is escaping me at the moment. But in any event, very interesting career Katona's had, but also a lot more experience compared to Bekzat Almakhan, who I think made as much as he could of a short notice opportunity against a fighter like Umar Nurmagomedov. And I have to wonder, if he didn't get that knockdown, would he even be favored here against a guy like Katona, who has so much more experience, both in the UFC and I think in MMA generally, and also is going to be fighting at home in Canada, and is somebody that I think the UFC, it's tricky to figure out what they're really feeling long term about trying to promote the Ultimate Fighter. The upcoming season, they know it's so bad in terms of how the current situation with star power right now that they're having DC and Chael Sonnen, who have both been retired for a while, be the head-to-head coaches on the upcoming season. But you look at what happened in a fight with, I think it was Francis Marshall and Marion Santos, and most people thought Marshall should have gotten at minimum a 29-28, if not a 30-27. Hardly anybody, even people that bet on Santos to win, thought that he actually won that fight. And it makes you wonder what the promotional interest was in propping up somebody like Santos to get a decision that he otherwise wouldn't have deserved. The flip side of that's one of the reasons why last week when Juliana Miller was in a fairly close fight with Ivana Petrovic, you still figured, even though she didn't do a lot of damage with control in the third round, that the fight was absolutely going to go to Miller in the final round, and it did. But then you wonder why the UFC went out of their way to give Ryan Loder an opponent like Azamat Bakoyev, I think his name was. In any event, Russian guy that looks like a future, if not contender, at least a future ranked guy, training out of American Top Team, ended up being like a 400 favorite. You kind of wonder where the UFC is at in terms of trying to prop up its Ultimate Fighter winners. I can think of another example of a guy that washed out of there recently, not recently, but within the last couple of years, and Michael Trezano. It feels like the UFC just wanted to cut bait at that point. And I guess the other argument you can make with Katona not being supported as a tough winner is that he actually has now won it twice, where he won it the first time, and because all of his fights go to decision, he's not necessarily the action fighter that the UFC wants to get behind, and as a result, they're just kind of willing to cut bait. You wonder if that's kind of what the case remains with Katona here, as he is preparing to go on the, if you don't count the Ultimate Fighter semifinal, I guess this would be his 5th straight appearance in in his second stint in the UFC. But in any event, Katona having the competitive fights he did against not only Armfield, but particularly Matsumoto, a guy that a lot of people feel like should still be undefeated despite taking his first loss to a veteran like Rob Font. I would think that if MMA math isn't perfect, but if Matsumoto were paired up with Bekzat Almakhan, I would think Matsumoto would be a fairly strong favorite, not like 300, 400 range, but would be favored to win, even if, Almakhan had a few more UFC fights under his belt. I still have to imagine Matsumoto would be favored. And Katona, and there's a lot of people that think Katona won that fight that he had against Matsumoto that was predominantly taking place on the feet. So you can't look at Almakhan's numbers from that fight and take them very seriously just because so much of it was spent in Nurmagomedov's control. I also don't really, even though full credit to him for getting the knockdown, I think we see a lot of times guys that don't really have the pressure on them to win in those short notice bookings, that are just kind of happy to be there for the sake of getting into the UFC. A lot of times are able to take advantage of the uncertainty that comes with that moment where their opponent isn't as able to thoroughly prepare for them as they were if they got a full camp or even a little bit more notice. Another recent example I can think of where a guy earned a knockdown where he, against someone that was like a minus 1,000 favorite where he otherwise wasn't really expected to, is when David Onama fought, I'm forgetting the name of the guy, but it's the guy that Timothy Kwamba beat on the card 2 weeks ago. His name was, bear with me, Roberto Romero, I believe. So he was able to get a knockdown in that fight too, but he ended up getting 30-27 in the same way that Mr. Almakhan did. So I don't really get why Almakhan's the favorite here. I won't be surprised if Katona drops another unanimous decision in Canada necessarily, but just given the difference in UFC experience and the fact that Katona's had competitive fights with higher level competition compared to what Almakhan has had at this point, I think he's worth a shot as an underdog here. So I am going to be taking him to get the win as an underdog. I'll say that he gets a 29-28 unanimous decision. The next fight is Jeong Lee and Daniel Santos. Lee enters 11-2, last appeared in July of last year when he had one of the craziest 1-minute fights you'll ever see with Hyder Emil, where they just straight up traded for about a minute before Emil threw something that felt like close to a 20-punch combo. And Lee, although he never got knocked down, was very visibly rocked and out on his feet, and the fight was graciously waved off. I did have Lee in that one, but I did end up taking Emil in his fight after that against William Gomi, getting a split decision there. Conversely, Daniel Santos was, I believe, supposed to fight about a month ago and pulled out of whatever his matchup, but he might have been preparing to fight Chris Gutierrez, I'm not quite. I think it was Chris Gutierrez. But in any event, he pulled out. He's been rebooked now here. We'll see if he ends up making it to fight day, because he has pulled out of something like 5 or 7 matchups he's had during his UFC run at this point. It's one of the reasons why he hasn't fought for a month shy of 2 years next month. Last time we saw him was against Johnny Munoz, where I don't know if you saw the post-fight pictures that Munoz posted after the groin kicks that he suffered in that fight that resulted in Santos getting a point deducted. But it was probably, I mean, he had like a catheter or something basically put. The guy was basically pissing into a plastic bag for a minute. It was not good. And it's not good when fighters get points deducted when they've been warned at the very beginning of fights that, you know, they're responsible for their weapons, and they still end up, you know, kicking to the groin area and not being more precise with their target selection. But in any event, a lot of people were feeling good about Santos when the line first came out for this fight. I believe he opened about minus 175, got blown out to 200. And then while I was taping this, you know, he got out to minus one. He was down to minus 140, but he was still the favorite. And I remember I made Castaneda when he fought him. I was in town in Chicago for my high school reunion, and so I was with a bunch of people I went to high school with, and they knew that I just ventured into doing, I just started MMA Rax a few months ago, and so one of them suggested we watch the UFC card together, and I was thrilled because I wouldn't have pushed that on them. And I think I was having, like, I had the momentum going in terms of, you know, picking my most confident picks correctly at that point. We did have to watch Ilir Talifi. Yeah, God, the Swedish guy that's built like a meatball. I can't even. I would have been able to say his name right 2 years ago. Now I can't do it. In any event, we had to watch him fight Alexei Oleinik, and that was, you know, you're thinking about when you're friends that don't watch MMA, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna, you know, we'll see if this card can actually sell them on that. This was not the apex card for doing that. So they had to watch that Talifi fight, whatever the guy's name is, and Alexei Oleinik. It's a fight between like two 40-year-old heavyweights. And then the last one we watched, which was a great fight, was Castaneda versus Santos. And I had Castaneda, and so they all, you know, were like, oh, okay, he thinks Castaneda is going to win, and Castaneda was favored. Castaneda has a great first round. He rocks Santos several times with head kicks, but is never quite able to put him away. Kind of comes back in the second round a little bit tired, perhaps from chasing the finish, and fades, and then Santos is able to have kind of not only an unexpected comeback, but a really terrific finish in terms of that knee against the fence. So that was the last fight we watched that day. I ended up watching the rest of the card just because I was curious, but they were a little bit spent after dedicating so much time to prelims after that. But that fight always lives pretty fondly in my memory, or I shouldn't even say fondly, but it's got space occupied in my head just because it's like, you know, it sucks to have that one lost in front of a bunch of people that took a chance on watching the sport and, you know, thinking about, you know, where, oh, this guy who is investing a lot of time into this is, you know, taking one side and it ends up not being right. But it is what it is. In any event, since that happened, Santos, I've been kind of waiting for the opportunity to, like, oh, you know, I'd like to be on the good side with this guy at some point. Because I think I might have taken the under when he fought Munoz, and or I might have taken Munoz as an underdog. But either way, whatever bet I had for that fight, I don't think was correct, or it might have been a stay away. I can't quite remember what it was because, you know, it was almost 2 years ago at this point. But I've been waiting for the opportunity to be on the Santos side, and so I put a lot of time into taping this one because I wanted to make sure that I got it right, because I did have the grade pretty close between these two. and the price was low enough on Santos that I thought, I'd like to be on this guy's side if I could. And while I was rewatching that Castaneda-Santos fight, what stood out to me was that I did not recall until I rewatched it that fight was actually not at bantamweight. It was a catchweight fight. It was at 140 pounds. And I remember thinking, Santos looks like he doesn't look like he has to do a super aggressive cut to get to 135. He doesn't look that much bigger not having to, and just didn't seem as athletically impressive as a guy like Jeong Lee does at 145. It was surprising to me looking back at that. And then I considered again, because this is on short notice and because Jeong Lee is a featherweight, this fight is almost certainly happening 10 pounds up a weight class from what Santos has been more typically comfortable fighting at. And Santos is also a guy that previously in his MMA career was even competing or took at least one or a couple fights at flyweight. So he's going to be small for this weight class compared to a guy like Jeong Lee. And when you compare that, or when you combine that with the fact that he hasn't fought in 2 years, I don't think that those things are a good pairing at all, frankly. So even if I think he might be a little bit more technically sophisticated than Jeong Lee is, Jeong Lee is going to be taller. He's going to have a 6-inch super significant reach advantage. And I think that's going to help him stay measured and land the bigger, more powerful shots. And he'll be able to take advantage of, even though Santos hasn't been finished and is tough, he's still a guy that we've seen take damage in a way that drops rounds as he did against Castaneda. And then a guy like Munoz was never going to test his striking to begin with. So I feel pretty good about I felt good about taking Jeong Lee as an underdog at the time that I put the pick out. And now, since then, the line is now flipped where it's just out of the pick'em range, and Lee is now a minus 121 favorite. So I'm wondering if the market is starting to come around to what I realize that Santos is probably going to be. And it'll be interesting to see during the face-off how much more physically impressive Lee is when standing directly across from Santos, and how that's going to affect not only where this fight ends up on the feet, but if this fight does go to the ground, who's going to have the strength advantage, one guy over the other? Because I can't imagine it's going to be Santos. So I'm going to say that Jeong Lee gets a 29-28 decision here. I'll say that, both these guys have around the same success and experience going the distance. So, I'll say Santos has a fairly decent start to this fight, but then just because it's on short notice and because he's fighting up a weight class, fighting a little bit heavier than he's accustomed to, Lee is able to start wearing on him and landing more effective shots the longer the fight goes, and is able to take the last 10 minutes and get a 29-28. So give me Jeong Lee to win by unanimous decision in what was an upset, now no longer. Hope you got on that line early when I put the pick out on Sunday. The next fight is Marc-Andre Barriault and Bruno Silva. Barriault enters 16-9, got knocked out in the first round by Dustin Stoltzfus in his last appearance. The last time the UFC was in Canada for UFC Edmonton. I believe I advocated staying away from betting Barriault in that card, and that was the correct decision for reasons that I'll get into here in a minute. Meanwhile, Silva enters on a 4-fight losing streak and last appeared at UFC 308 against Ismail Nardiev. I believe that was Nardiev's comeback bid with the UFC after falling out earlier in his career. And Nardiev was able to take a pretty commanding unanimous decision win there. I believe it was a 30-27, and he might have even been the underdog. I know it was around a pick'em there. But this I think a lot of people have been saying this is like the worst fight on the card, and I agree to a certain extent, but I still think it's an interesting matchup. I think it's good matchmaking relative to where these two guys are at in their career. It's a good chance for Barriault to save his UFC job, but at the same time, it's also a good opportunity for Silva to, if not save his UFC job, at least conclude his MMA career on a win, given what he's previously been good at versus the weakness that Barriault has had of late. If you're worried about Barriault here, it's obviously because of the chin. And it's one thing to get knocked out in less than 20 seconds by Chidi and Jaquani. It's another thing to get knocked out by Joe Pyfer inside of 90 seconds. And for that to be your second consecutive knockout loss of your most recent fights. Not great, but not necessarily red flags, causes for concern. Getting knocked out by Dustin Stoltzfus is, because the only other person in Dustin Stoltzfus's MMA career that has ever been knocked out by him was Joe Pyfer, and that was on a Contender Series appearance where it was a result of a slam KO that caused an injury to Pyfer's, if not his elbow, then his shoulder, I believe, while he was trying to, plant or stop the slam takedown or what have you. In any event, it was an injury TKO to a part of the body that wasn't the chin. So the first legitimate fist-to-face knockout of Dustin Stoltzfus' entire MMA career was Marc-Andre Barriault in Barriault's most recent appearance. Getting knocked out by a guy that has never really been known for his knockout power and gets his first one at the UFC level is never ever a good sign for long-term durability. There's no way to dance around it. The only thing that could possibly outweigh something worse than that is a guy that is on a big, sizable losing streak that has verbally demonstrated that his heart really isn't in it as much as it used to be. And that is exactly what the case is with Bruno Silva. He came out after he lost to Ismail Nardiev and said, I frankly just didn't really want to be in there. My heart wasn't in it. And that's about as big of a red flag as you can have. Now, apparently on his Instagram, he's talking about how he's been taking this fight more seriously and he's eager to get back in there. And I do wonder to a certain extent, how physically impressive is he going to look now that, USADA's out of the picture for the UFC? Because most of the success that Silva had earlier in his MMA career was during a time where a lot of people would point to the fact that it looked like he was juicing. I believe he got suspended for steroids before he got to the UFC, which is why he didn't appear between his last fight prior to the UFC at the end of 2018 up until he fought Wellington Turman in his debut in June of 2021. So you're talking about like a 2.5-year layoff there between when he made his UFC debut and the last time he fought before then. Pretty sure that was steroid related, and ever since he had to get clean, I mean, he's 4-6 overall in the UFC, but he is 1-6 in his last 7 appearances, and that includes getting finished by Gerald Mearshart and Brendan Allen. Granted, he's never been knocked out. He has been submitted 7 times. I think that the possibility for a club and sub can be there for Barriault, but I think the much more likely result is that he just kind of slow cook Silva to a 30-27 decision win here, and that's what I'm thinking is going to happen. Silva hasn't won. The Brad Tavares knockout was a little bit fluky. I had the over 2.5 in that one. I didn't quite feel comfortable betting Tavares as a favorite, so I decided to take the over 2.5, thinking his durability was going to hold up, because Tavares to that point, I believe, had only been knocked out. I guess he's been knocked out a handful of times actually, That was his fourth knockout loss of his MMA career, and then he took another one to RoboCop Rodriguez 2 fights after that. But I figured that his durability was going to hold up better than it ended up doing against Bruno Silva. In any event, I still think, and some people would disagree, but I do think that fight was stopped a little bit quickly. I think it's the speed with which Tavares went down, why they called it off as quickly as they did. And if that fight had gone into the second and or even the third round, where would Silva have been at as someone who has not fought to much success when going the distance in their MMA career? Now, I know I talked about Silva popping for PEDs. I believe that Marc-Andre Barriault also did at one point during his UFC run. I believe it was after the Oscar Pichota fight, and then he fought Abu Azaitar and got a knockout in the last 5 seconds of their fight at UFC 260. So, you can make a similar criticism, I guess, with Barriault if you want to make with Silva. The difference is Barriault's at Killcliff FC. His heart is very much still in this. They're fighting in Canada. All of this is a setup, I think, for Barriault to save his UFC job. If he can't do it in this spot against a guy like Silva, frankly, both of them are probably going to get cut, but certainly whoever loses this fight is going to end up getting cut. Silva, people talk about when they're thinking about retirement, when you're already kind of grappling with that reality, you haven't, and, it's hard to get your heart all the way back into it. And the fact that bit of doubt has already crept into Silva's head and he's verbalized that, even if he's saying he's taking this fight seriously, history is just not kind to fighters that are on 4-fight or worse losing streaks. Acknowledging the risk here that it's very, very possible that Silva makes everybody that drinks the juice on Barriault look very stupid. I'm not willing to say that his chin has been totally disintegrated. If he gets knocked out here by Silva at that point, then I think it's fair to say this guy's chin is totally gone. As bad as his damage tolerance may be, I think there's still a little bit just enough remaining here that he should be able to take Silva to a 30-27 decision. Look, if Silva couldn't knock out Chris Weidman, I mean, you could very easily make the case that Weidman's damage tolerance is even worse at this point than Barriault's is. And think about how awful Silva's performance was against Weidman, eye pokes notwithstanding. Give me Marc-Andre Barriault to win a 30-27 decision and save his UFC roster spot, which will probably get used for getting knocked out by maybe 2. I could see him getting paired up with someone like Marco Tullio in his fight after this and getting served up to slaughter for him and maybe 1 or 2 other contender series promising middleweight prospects after this fight. But for now, I think they've got him on the Canada card against an opponent like this for the express purpose of let's make sure this guy can save his job. So give me Marc-Andre Barriault to win by unanimous decision, and au revoir to Bruno Silva. The next fight is Navajo Stirling and Ivan Erslan. Stirling is 6-0, last fought against Tuco Takos, also known as George Takos, Tokos, what have you, Tuco Tokos, at the last UFC event last year. I believe that was in Tampa, Covington versus Buckley, where he won a 30-27 decision, where everybody expected him to finish Takos, and it didn't happen. And because he didn't finish Takos, everybody freaked out and was like, oh my God, what a terrible performance. He's still 30-27, the guy, okay? He didn't drop a single round. I feel like a bad performance would have been him giving a round away badly or getting knocked down and having to come back or something. He won the fight handily. Yeah, you want to see a finish, but just because you don't get a finish doesn't mean the guy didn't come out and get the job done. He got the job done and did it in resounding fashion. For a guy that had only had 5 MMA fights prior to that, I'm willing to say that he did well enough. And that's coming as someone that bet the under, anticipating a finish and not getting it. I still think relative to Stirling, his performance was fine. Even though I thought he was going to finish him and would have liked to see a finish, I'm not holding it against him that he didn't get one. Conversely, Erslan debuted. I believe it was a short notice rebooking at UFC Paris last year, Moicano Saint-Denis, where he fought Ian Cutelaba to a split decision. As I've talked about on here before, the judges at that event were absolutely horrendous. They gave Jackie Cavalcanti a split decision over Nora Cornell that should not have been a split decision. It should have been a unanimous win for Cavalcanti. They made this fight a split decision where Ian Cutelaba won, I think, in pretty resounding unanimous fashion. And they also, of course, infamously robbed Joe Anderson Brito against William Gomi. Karma came back for the latter when he lost a split decision to Haider Emil. But that fight cost me a winning event. I was very critical of the judging at that event, and that judging reflected in Erslan's debut against Cutelaba. It should not have been a split decision. Erslan, I guess you could... I don't think that this guy offers much more than Tukos did, honestly. I was kind of looking at their stats, and I think Erslan is like smaller than Takos is, but I don't really see what he does exponentially better than Takos that makes me think that he's going to present any sort of problems for Stirling in any areas that we haven't really seen him tested in. Erslan's got a 1-1 submission record. All of his wins in the last 7 years since 2018 have been first-round finishes, and Stirling has never been finished. So barring this guy coming out and just getting a crazy, I don't want to say lucky, but certainly a fortuitous exchange where he's able to get the better of this guy that has a wealth of kickboxing experience, trains with a much better camp in city kickboxing, and still hasn't been defeated in MMA to this point. I just don't see how this really ends up any different than Stirling's last result. So that's really pretty much all I have to say about this one. I know that the story for both of these guys is still pretty unwritten at this point, but I know that Stirling's going to be younger. He's going to have a pretty huge reach advantage. And for a guy who is exclusively won by first round finishes, almost all of which were knockouts in the last 7 years, Stirling is going to be the guy with all the striking upside in this fight. And he did a good job against Takos, who was going to have to try to wrestle or grind against him on the cage in order to win some kind of decision in that fight. He did a good job mitigating what was presumably Takos' only path to success in that fight. I don't see why Erslan would have any more success in that area than Takos did against Stirling. Really, I think the only other advantage Erslan has here is more experience going the distance. But I don't even know how much that really counts for, given, again, all of the success this guy has had in the last 7 years has been exclusively winning fights in the first round. So if I'm Stirling, keep this fight measured. Don't get impatient. He didn't get impatient against Takos. I don't see why he would get impatient in this fight to where he would make a mistake that potentially compromises the fight. I think the longer this one goes, the better he looks, and the less success that Erslan is able to have. I think Stirling's going to do just fine here. He was a 310 favorite when I put the pick out, dipped down to around the 250, 265 range, but is back up to 300 again. I don't see why this plays out any differently than his last fight. I think this guy's probably already due for a step up in competition, not like a ranked opponent or anything, but certainly even as shallow as 205 is. I think that this guy, it would be much more interesting to see him fight someone like Zhang Mingyang than the Ivan Erslans of the world. So, maybe he'll end up getting the loser of Bukauskas and Cutelaba, which we'll talk about next. But I think, if they get a Pacific or Asiatic card at some point in the future this year, Yeong versus Stirling could be an interesting matchup, unless you want to prop both of those guys up that are still in their 20s as prospects in an otherwise shallow division. In any event, I think Stirling's going to cruise here. 30-27. Give me Navajo Stirling to do City Kickboxing proud. I don't know how long Ivan Erslan is for the UFC, but we'll probably see him get matched up with a Contender Series winner at 205 later this year after that season happens. In any event, for now, give me Stirling to win by unanimous decision. The next fight is Ion Cutelaba and Modestas Bukauskas. Cutelaba enters 19-10-1, last fought in February at Fight Night Cejudo versus Song. I believe that was UFC Seattle, where he beat Ibo Aslan after beating Ivan Erslan by first-round submission in a fight where I picked Aslan to win. Cutelaba has been a pretty difficult fighter for me to cap. I did fade him against Johnny Walker when Walker was an underdog, pretty considerable one too, I think around like a plus 180 underdog, and was able to get that result correct. However, I did take Cutelaba as like a 300 favorite against Ryan Spann. I took, I believe, the over when he fought Kennedy Nzechukwu, and that fight got promoted to the main event after Derek Lewis pulled out on fight day, and Nzechukwu finished him shortly after taking a groin kick, and recognizing that he already had Cutelaba hurt, said, no, I don't want to stop, take a timeout. I want to keep going and put the pressure on Cutelaba and get the win. And he did. I believe I took him as a favorite against Tanner Boser, but it's possible that I took Tanner Boser instead. I honestly can't remember, but I did take Cutelaba against Felipe Lins, I believe, as a slight favorite. And even though he got the knockdown against Lins in the first round and it won him the round, it wasn't scored as a knockdown for some reason. And he wasn't really able to do much the last 10 minutes, and Lins kind of took advantage of him on the ground, which was surprising to a lot of people, given the wrestling people like to say Cutelaba has. In any event, I have not had a lot of success capping this guy, only fading him, never backing him. Conversely, Bukauskas enters 17-6, knocked out Rafael Cerquera in the first round of what I believe was the opening fight at UFC Seattle. I've had a little more success with capping Bukauskas than Cutelaba. I did, I think, take the under when he fought Tyson Pedro, but I believe I also might have put out Pedro as a favorite, and neither one of those bets ended up hitting in that case, so I got that fight totally wrong. Took the over when he fought Zach Pauga, that hit. Faded him when he fought Vitor Petrino, that was correct. Took him as a favorite in his last two fights against Marcin Prachnio and Rafael Cerquera. So I've gotten 4 of his fights correct in a row in terms of figuring out where, what his results were going to be. Both of these guys have had very volatile runs in the UFC. Cutelaba obviously more so than Bukauskas, who's now on his second stint with the UFC and certainly looks improved from what his first stint was. But yeah, I think this fight is pretty appropriately a pick-em. It's tough to get a sense of who's really going to have the advantage over the other. I know Bukauskas is going to have a reach advantage at the very least. But, in these close fights, I tend to favor the guy that is going to have the more well-rounded skill set. I think that's pretty clearly Cutelaba. He's got twice as much UFC experience, and he's training with a better camp in Extreme Couture than the Baltic whatever Bukauskas is named. Gintis Combat. And his nickname is the Baltic Gladiator, but yeah, I don't know if Gintis Combat is in Lithuania or what have you. But in any event, It's very, very possible that Bukauskas, with his newfound, more measured striking, is able to kind of piece Cutelaba up or keep him at distance, not able to, wrestle him as effectively, and either, take advantage of his attrition and knock him out in the first round, or Bukauskas has had a lot more success going the distance than Cutelaba has, so it might be the longer this one gets drawn out, the more it might probably benefit Bukauskas to try a point fighting approach. But this is a fight at 205. Cutelaba, if nothing else, does have much more success and frequency in terms of volume with landing takedowns than Bukauskas has demonstrated an interest in. And what is a pick'em? When I put the pick out for Cutelaba, he was the slight underdog. This fight is still almost nearly dead even on a pick'em, but Cutelaba now minus 112, the slightest of slight favorites. But is it still the slight underdog at some other books? Bovada still has him at minus 105, I think, at this point. But in any event, I'm going to say that Cutelaba is able to take down Bukauskas and kind of wear on him over the first 10 minutes. And I'll say that Cutelaba is able to get a late finish. Yeah. I don't think he's had actually, now looking at this, he hasn't had a finish outside of the first round, I don't think, since like over 10 years ago. When he's finishing you early. Otherwise, it gets a little bit hairy the longer it goes the distance. So he did get the knockdown in that first round against Linz. And he obviously had Erslan hurt, I think, a little bit too. So he's definitely got good power early. He's going to have to crash the pocket in order to get in on Bukauskas' reach advantage, and it's possible Bukauskas catches him, but I think Cutelaba forcing the issue a little bit is going to make Bukauskas uncomfortable, and he'll be able to build off of that for a finish. So rather than saying the fight goes late, I'll say Cutelaba gets the first round knockout on Bukauskas. The longer this one goes, the more nervous I will be for Cutelaba, but because he does have the more well-rounded skill set and better experience here, if not going the distance, then at least in the UFC, I think that that'll carry him to a 29-28 win in the event that he's not able to get the first-round knockout. But I'll say that he does get the first-round knockout. So give me eye on Cutelaba to win and get his third win in a row, and it'll be the first 3-fight win streak he's had in the UFC. The next fight is Jasmine Jasudavicius and Jessica Andrade. Jasudavicius is 13-3. Last fought earlier this year in February at Fight Night Adesanya Imavov. I believe that was UFC Saudi Arabia, against Mayra Bueno Silva, dropping down from bantamweight to flyweight. Jasudavicius won a pretty dominant decision there that I think bodes pretty well for her matchup here against a former strawweight, longtime strawweight in Jessica Andrade. Andrade enters 26-13, lost a pretty, I don't want to quite say it was lopsided, but it was, pretty clear that Natalia Silva was getting the better of her at Fight Night Burns Brady last year at the Apex. But did get a split decision win over the recently retired Marina Rodriguez prior to that. Knocked out Mackenzie Dern at UFC 295 in her fight before that one. So she's still got the ability to lamp you, even at her size up in this weight class. But Dern is someone who I think had been finished a few times before. Actually, that was the first time Dern. That's the only time Dern's ever been finished. So, but Dern's also someone that has no knockout wins in MMA. So you figured Andrade was going to get the better of her on the feet regardless. In any event, Jasudavicius, I mean, she's probably, of all the Canadians on the UFC roster, it seems like she's got the brightest hopes of being a title contender of anybody right now. I mean, her run in the last year or so, even prior to that, if you include the Tracy Cortez loss, I mean, it's been pretty dominant and extremely impressive. And I think that it's really hard to ignore, like, for someone who's already got really good size for the weight class. I mean, she's going to be so much bigger than Andrade here. So Andrade is going to have to navigate a half-foot reach disadvantage and a ridiculous. It's very rare that you see a half-foot discrepancy in height, but that's exactly what you're getting here. And and that's pretty alarming for this low of a weight class to have to be dealing with that difference in size. And Andrade up at flyweight, I mean, she's had pretty good, like, I wouldn't quite say elite, but very good takedown defense for her UFC career, but it hasn't been as elite as it was at strawweight, because now she's fighting women substantially bigger than the women that were just a little bit bigger than her at strawweight, but she made up for it just because of how compact and a power puncher that she is. Now she's giving up even more size to the flyweights, and women that aren't necessarily spectacularly well-rounded mixed martial artists like Erin Blanchfield or Tatiana Suarez have been able to exploit that, whether it's in the case of being predominantly an excellent grappler the way that Blanchfield is, or a predominantly dominant wrestler the way Suarez is. They were both able to exploit her to the point of getting a win against her on the ground and get a submission. And then sandwiched in between that, you have a fight with Yan Xiaonan where she got, I mean, it's one thing to get knocked out in an MMA at the UFC level. It's another thing when you're a woman that gets knocked out in the first round at the UFC level. But when you get knocked out the way that Yan Xiaonan knocked out Andrade, where you watch the reverse angle replay and you see her get hit and you see her eyes roll and just go blank, and she hits the ground and she is like, they stop it almost immediately because they can tell that she's done. I mean, you have to wonder, for a woman that has been knocked out 4 times prior to that, even now that she's added weight and is up a weight class relative to where her chin used to be, you got to wonder how great her damage tolerance is at this point. So now you combine that with the fact that she has given up finishes to fighters that have been either excellent grapplers for flyweight or excellent wrestlers for flyweight, but not necessarily both in tandem, with someone in Jasudavicius who blends those two skill sets very well and has, in her most recent fight, dominated a woman that, and it might have been a bit of an expedited title shot, but she's still got a title shot all the same up at bantamweight. She's going to have great size for the weight class, even moving down, and she moves down, and Jasudavicius just totally dominates her on the mat in an area where, you know, I would even argue Bueno Silva at this point is a more proven submission specialist in women's MMA than Jasudavicius is, and Jasudavicius still totally outclassed her there. I mean, if she just dominated a bantamweight title challenger in her most recent appearance, what do you think she's going to do to a former strawweight that she has half-foot height and reach advantages on? I understand why Jasudavicius is a 300 favorite here. I was going to prepare to bet her as a 300 favorite. I really had to think about and stomach if I wanted to go to that point. I was thankful that when I put the pick out that she dipped down to around 265 territory, so I could say, okay, I'm putting her out as a 200 range favorite. I hope she sticks around there. Now she's rebounded back into 320, and she opened at 400, which I think is a little extreme and disrespectful to the power that Andrade is going to have when this fight is standing. But I think as long as Jasudavicius is able to close distance, and I think that she'll be able to manage distance as well as she wants here. But Andrade is going to force the issue because she's going to have to get in close in order to land power shots. And I think as soon as she gets in close, that's just going to give an opportunity for Jasudavicius to clinch up, put the fight on the fence if she needs to, and work against the fence to get the takedowns that she needs. And then once this fight is on the ground, this is just going to be in her world. I don't know if she finishes Andrade, but it really wouldn't surprise me if she ends up getting her third knockout win of her career here, just by overpowering Andrade. I'm going to say that Jasudavicius gets a 30-27 here. It's possible Andrade steals one of the rounds with a moment of damage, landing a big shot or something, and maybe she does enough anti-grappling where Jasudavicius isn't able to land a lot of ground and pound or get in a deep submission attempt during one of the rounds where Andrade lands one of her big shots. But I think there's a wide enough gap in the size of these two women relative to where Andrade used to be compared to the woman that Jasudavicius just dominated in her last fight that I have to imagine Jasudavicius is going to make a lot of the Canadian fans happy here. So give me Jasudavicius to win 30-27. Late finish wouldn't surprise me, but I just think that this is too big of a matchup for Andrade to handle, and that she's going to be needing to fight smaller flyweights if she wants to have any success at this weight class. As she prepares to, she's not quite in her decline stage yet. It's crazy that she's 3 years younger than Jasudavicius here, but I don't expect age to really be an issue. And frankly, if between these two women, even though Andrade has nearly 3 times the experience that Jasudavicius does, you can't deny that Andrade has the far worse attrition here compared to a woman like Jasmine that's never been finished. So give me Jasudavicius to win by unanimous decision. The featured prelim of UFC 315 is Malott, and Charles Radtke. Malott enters 11-2-1, fought a pretty lackadaisical, not due to his own effort, but really more so his opponent, got a pretty lazy, uninspired decision against Trevin Giles at UFC Edmonton, in which Giles, frankly, looked just pretty disinterested in fighting. And I believe Mike Malott, Malott. It's got to be Malott, right? I mean, that's the more French-sounding thing. Whatever. In any event, 30-27 Trevin Giles. So I don't know how much we can really take from that performance in terms of him being back after, the huge letdown against Neil Magny. But in any event, he got the job done in his bounce-back effort. Meanwhile, Charles Radtke knocked out Matthew Semmelsberger in less than a minute at Fight Night Magny versus Pratis last year. I did take Semmelsberger as the underdog. Semmelsberger promptly retired after that performance. Of course, I took Radtke as an underdog against Carlos Pratis. And even though I think that fight was a little bit closer than people remembered, it never really felt like Pratis was ever in any serious danger. And obviously the way that it ended, where Pratis just kind of, his eyes got big and he went, ooh, and then got him with the liver shot. Like, that was what really set off like the sniper comparisons for Pratis was that result, much more so than I think his performance against Giles prior to that point or anything else. And then Radtke was also an underdog against Gilbert Urbina. I thought Urbina was I took him as the favorite, and Chuck Buffalo, as people like to refer to him, was able to get the underdog win there as well. But he was a favorite against Semmelsberger, so I think he's 1-1 as an underdog. And obviously he had to be favored against Blood Diamond, and I mean Blood Diamond really shouldn't have even been in the UFC at that point. And I think it's important to remember that Blood Diamond fight because Radtke's only faced 4 takedown attempts in the UFC. 3 of them were from Blood Diamond. And then I believe the other one that he got was from Gilbert Urbina in what was a desperation attempt after Urbina had already been hurt. And he was someone whose chin had already been kind of capitalized on in earlier fights. So I think it's tough to kind of get a sense of how good Radtke actually is. There's a lot of people that they love to talk about the left hook and how great it is, and the guy's at Valley Flow Striking, so because he's with Belal and Ignacio Bahamondes, he must be leveling up constantly. But I think it's important to remember that this is a guy that got knocked out by a fighter in Justin Montalvo. Only, that was back in 2021, so 4 years ago. And Montalvo's only got a 6-2 record. He's got 4 fights in Bellator, but not someone who's really had a ton of seasoning in MMA. And at that point, he was 3-3 as a fighter before ripping off a pretty long streak over the last 3 years. Throughout his early 30s, now 34 years old. So he's only had like 2, including Contender Series, has only had like 2 fewer appearances in the UFC than what Mike Malott has had. But I still think that Malott has fought the better competition here, Mickey Gall notwithstanding. But I think that Neil Magny fight probably, gave him a much more realistic sense of what he's capable of and kind of did a better reset of expectations. Because for a while, even going into that Magny fight, there were people that were singing Malott's praises more so than Jasudavicius's in terms of who's the Canadian fighter that has the highest title aspirations. Obviously, Malott's not going to be that guy. I don't even know if this guy is a future ranked guy in the welterweight class because that division is stupid deep. But I do think that he's somebody that is going to be able to handle a lot of the mid-card talent in the way that he has previously against guys like Adam Fugit and most recently Trevin Giles. Who it's important to remember Giles was winning that fight with Carlos Prates pretty handily as recently as last year until Prates, did what a lot of other people were able to do and took advantage of the attrition that Giles has had moving down from middleweight on an already bad chin and was able to put him out late in the second round in a fight that he was otherwise losing. So I think a lot of people, they like that Radtke is, like I said, not only a Valley Flow Striking and left hook over, but also that the guy talks a lot of smack in his press conferences, not only to the other fighters, but also the fans. And because of his mic skills, I think people are kind of like emotionally invested in him doing well. I think there's still a lot to prove, and I think that Mike Malott has the better, or at least the more well-rounded skill set. And I can't imagine that they would keep putting this guy on the Canadian cards, expecting him to lose. I think there's a pretty targeted effort here to try to prop up the Chicago fight, or not Chicago. Said Chicago because of Valley Flow Striking being there and Belal Muhammad also being on this card. But the Canadian fighters, there's a concentrated effort to prop the Canadian fighters up on this card, obviously, as we've kind of seen in the past, Brad Katona's notwithstanding. In any event, I like Mike Malott. If this fight gets extended, the longer it goes, the better I'll feel about it. I'll be a little bit nervous about him in the beginning just because he has been knocked out in the first round prior to coming to the UFC before, but that was against an opponent in Hakeem Dawodu that I think, frankly, is a more challenge, or I don't know if this would still be the case because I don't even know if Dawodu has fought since that huge letdown performance he had against Julian Erosa. he did fight Cub Swanson, and a lot of people think he got screwed in that fight, and that was almost 2 years ago at this point. It hasn't fought since, but still think that guy, for all the UFC appearances that he had, was a more proven opponent than Radtke, even though Malott fought Dawodu all the way back in 2014, I think well before either of them were in the UFC. In any event, Radtke is someone that has also been knocked out multiple times. Pratis got him with the body shot. I think the Montalvo fight might have also been a body shot. I don't know if that was it wasn't in the first round, but I don't know if it was necessarily a reflection of his chin. But both of these guys have shown, somewhat concerning damage tolerance, and both of them have pretty good power too. I know at least one person that is hedging on the under in this fight, which is around the same price that Malott's money line is. But I think that there's enough of, because I believe Malott will win, and that the longer this fight goes, the more it'll favor his skill set compared to Radtke's. I know there's some, kind of reinforce the point that the people behind Radtke are just kind of, emotionally invested or whatever. There was one show I watched. I watched a few different MMA podcasts, not just, ones that are focused on betting results, but just kind of forecasting results generally, throughout the week. And there was one this week where some guy, while the live feed was happening, commented as just some random YouTube guy that, I used to be at Radtke's gym and I know how good his grappling is. And while the people were talking about the fight on the show, they used that to reinforce their own belief that Radtke is, somehow as good of a grappler as Malott is, even though Malott has 3 times as many MMA submission wins as Radtke does. And in addition to that, Malott actually has 2 UFC submission wins over Johan Lioness and Adam Fugit. And Radtke he won a fight by submission prior in his last fight prior to getting his shot against Blood Diamond at UFC 293, but otherwise, I mean, it's clear, I think, that Malott is the more proven, well-rounded guy here. So it won't surprise me necessarily if Radtke is able to get the first round knockout, but I also think he's kind of first round knockout or bust, despite the fact that, the result everybody remembers from Malott's UFC career is gassing late against Magny. I do think that he will, if this fight does get extended, I still expect him to have more success the later it goes. So give me Mike Malott to win. I'll say he gets a 29-28 decision. The price has come down on him a little bit as the week has gone on. I believe he's down to like 170 now. He's dropped again to 164. So looks like there's a few people that are gradually gaining confidence in Radtke, but I still think that there's still a lot left to be written relative to Radtke's UFC career, whereas I think we've got a little bit better of a reading on Malott. And if this is a fight that is, close decision, could go either way if it comes down to the second round or something, I would think that the Canadian crowd is going to make the difference in terms of an impression on the judges. So I'll take Mike Malott to win a 29-28 decision win over Charles Radtke. The first fight on the main card as of Wednesday night at UFC 315 is Benoit Saint-Denis and Kyle Prepolec. What a joke. Benoit Saint-Denis is 13-3, lost by doctor's stoppage to Renato Moicano at Fight Night Paris last year, the event that was named Moicano Saint-Denis. Conversely, Prepolec has not fought in the UFC since losing a unanimous decision to Austin Hubbard in 2019. He is 4-1 in MMA since then, but has not fought for 10 months. He has won 3 straight fights by first-round knockout, that being said. But he is 35 now compared to being 29 years old the last time he fought in the UFC, while Saint-Denis is 29 years old himself. Saint-Denis, it opened like a minus, 1,500 favorite. He's since been bet down to like minus 1,000. This is the highest level matchup that Prepolec has had, and he hasn't fought in 10 months, and he's taking this on a week notice. I would think it's going to be Benoit Saint-Denis first round knockout, but at this price, there's no reason really to bet this. And it could end. I think it's first round finish either way. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up going for a club and sub instead. But especially because Prepolec's never been knocked out. But he is 35, and this is the biggest step up in competition of his life. It really stinks that Saint-Denis wouldn't take the fight against somebody like Gamrot to like make this card a little bit more palatable. That he felt like he needed, like he was only, especially preparing for a guy as dangerous as Yoel Alvarez, that you wouldn't fight somebody like Gamrot, who's been basically a decision machine his entire UFC run. And you're not even being asked to go 5 rounds with the guy. It's just a 3-round fight. It's very, very disappointing from a guy that a lot of people have called God of War. I saw at least one person refer to him as Fraud of War this week because of that. But fraud is a term that gets thrown around quite a lot these days. In any event, don't bet this. Just hope that Saint-Denis gets the first round finish and hope that they move this off of the pay-per-view card and put another fight in there that deserves it more. I can't imagine that. I mean, what I think would be the best move for them at this point is, I get not wanting to move the Jasmine Andrade fight up because then you've got 3 women's fights against 2 men's fights. But because so many people were insistent that the Alvarez Saint-Denis fight to open the card was the best fight in terms of a violence matchup on the card, I think that the way you make up for that is that you turn the pay-per-view into especially if you're actually trying to sell pay-per-views here, maybe even to make up disappointing ticket sales, which it seems like there have been some in this case, is you bump up 2 of the fights from the prelims to make this a 6-card main card, or 6-fight main card. And one of those that you would bump up is Jasudavicius Andrade, and then you would bump up another one, maybe Bukauskas Cutelaba, or maybe even Almakhan Katona, selling the fact that Katona is a tough winner fighting in Canada as the opening fight. I know that wouldn't necessarily be super appetizing to a lot of people, but I still think there might be a better argument for that than there would be for Malott against Radtke, given Malott, I believe, was on the main card for 297 and obviously disappointed in that effort, even though Katona lost on the same card last year in Canada. But in any event, that's what I think they should do to try to salvage this a little bit. Remains to be seen if they'll do that, but it would be kind of embarrassing to have this guy who is 0-2 in the UFC and hasn't fought in the promotion for 6 years and is getting an emergency week's notice call-up, fight this guy that headlined a fight night in his most recent appearance, was in a co-main on a pay-per-view last year in a 5-round fight with Dustin Poirier, and instead of taking a ranked opponent on short notice that wanted to fight him, he's fighting this guy that is effectively a jobber. I mean, come on. What are we doing here? Get this fight off of the main card. Replace it with at least one men's fight, if not one men's fight and the Jasudavicius Andrade fight, and try to at least not God, I don't want to curse on this show because I don't think the algorithm likes that very much, but don't grin for, the people when you're trying to sell them on this pay-per-view when the opening fight is Saint-Denis versus Prepolec. Benoit Saint-Denis by first round knockout, but what a waste, honestly, of a main card spot. Get this out of here. Don't bet on this. And just smile and nod if Saint-Denis gets the finish, and then let's move on to the next fight. The next fight is Natalia Silva and Alexa Grasso. Silva enters 18-5-1, most recently fought at Fight Night Burns Brady last year at the Apex, where she took a unanimous decision over Jessica Andrade that I briefly mentioned earlier in this card when discussing Andrade's fight with Jasudavicius. Conversely, Alexa Grasso is 16-4-1. She most recently fought at UFC 306 in the co-main event in the final fight of her trilogy with Valentina Shevchenko, in which she finally lost the title that she won over Shevchenko at UFC 285 in March 2 years ago. I did more tape on this one than any other fight on the card. I watched the first two fights of the trilogy between Grasso and Shevchenko. I skipped the third one because that one was still pretty fresh in my mind. And honestly, watching the line for that fight going into it, that was one of the fights that motivated me to finally jump into putting out picks on women's MMA this year. Because I remember seeing that Shevchenko was not like the clear-cut favorite in that fight, that I think she was like a pick'em underdog or outright underdog in that one, and thinking she only lost the first two fights because of two very boneheaded mistakes that if she just doesn't make that same mistake a third time, and she's one of the best fighters, women's mixed martial artists ever, she's going to dominate Grasso. And that's exactly what she did. And she won 50-45 basically in the rematch, except for like maybe one round where Grasso had a guillotine that never really even seriously threatened Shevchenko. So seeing that and being so confident in that result prior to it happening and then it actually happening, I was thinking, okay, there's value to be had here. You know, I trust my instincts and my analysis. I can't sit on the sidelines anymore. And I had a bad start to the year with women's picks, but I did go on a nice little run of 6 in a row that certainly helped me with the last pay-per-view. Thank you, Verna Jandaroba. I missed 2 last week at UFC. Oh, God, I already forgot where the card was last week. Des Moines, Iowa. Yeah, forgive me for, making Iowa an afterthought so soon after. But in any event, certainly some higher-level women's matchups on the card this week. So I rewatched those 2 fights from the first 2 fights from the trilogy. And, I mean, look, I think that you could probably make the argument that Grasso is going to be the more well-rounded fighter here. The question is, are you confident enough in Silva's striking where you'd feel comfortable paying a 2-to-1 price on her in order to get it done? And that was why I wanted to put the amount of tape in that I did, because I would have felt comfortable betting Silva in that 100 range, but I wasn't quite there with the 200 range. And after watching the first 2 fights of the Shevchenko-Grasso trilogy in tandem with Silva's most recent performances against Viviane Araújo and Jessica Andrade, I feel pretty good about Silva winning this fight. Even though Grasso has over 2 times as much UFC experience, obviously was a champion in this division very recently and had to become one of the only women to beat Valentina Shevchenko to do so. And I don't want to quite call it a fluke. I mean, she won the first round against Shevchenko in their first fight and seemed like she was doing pretty well in that 4th round, to where it would have at least been 2-2. And even though I don't think the second fight should have been a draw, that fight really just came down to how you scored the first round, which is why it came out to a split draw. But it would have been Shevchenko to win if the last round hadn't been inexplicably scored a 10-8 on one judge's card for Grasso, which I wonder how much that was kind of gamed a little bit, just because they were able to milk it for a trilogy when, women's MMA was kind of desperate for drama and a storyline, and Shevchenko finally kind of got a rival, even though she clearly blew it out of the water in the last chapter. But in any event, rather than keep talking about Grasso, who I think, should be able to have some boxing success in this fight, obviously. And I think another thing to consider with Grasso too is that in that first trilogy, or in that first fight of the trilogy, I think it was at the end of the second round. It might have been the first, but I think it was the end of the second round. Her coaches told her, you got to stop kicking because it's just going to give Shevchenko an easy opportunity to get in on the legs. And even though I don't think Grasso is sophisticated or impressive of a kicker as Silva is, she had still demonstrated a much more well-rounded striking skill set previously in the UFC with more kicks in fights where she didn't have to worry about the takedown threat as much as she did during the Shevchenko trilogy. So she wasn't kicking as much as she previously demonstrated. I wonder how much more she's going to kick in this fight now that she doesn't necessarily have to worry about the takedowns as much against an opponent like Silva. All that being said, Silva in her two most recent appearances, and granted one was Viviana Rujao, who was a bad striking matchup for her, but Jessica Andrade, even though, wasn't going to enjoy the size advantage that someone like Jasmine Jasudavicius is going to have over Andrade. Silva was still bigger, just not, super pronouncedly so. She did still have a reach advantage. But Andrade was going to pressure her and try to land big punches. And both of those women, Araujo and Andrade, both really pressured her back against the fence. But she did such a good job skirting the cage and never allowing herself to get pressed all the way in. And every time that one of them would try to come in and land strikes on her, she was, either she was countering with either kicks or punches, and all of her spinning stuff looked crisp. And even though she gave up the back a couple times to Araujo was never able to do anything super tangible with it. Whatever brief takedown she landed, Silva was able to get right back up pretty quickly afterwards. I was so impressed with not only Silva's ability to fight while skirting the cage, but to return fire in a way that prevented opponents from ever landing anything totally compromising. And for a woman that is fighting a style that is, I think, pretty rare for other women in mixed martial arts to replicate. I mean, they were comparing her to Wonderboy Thompson in terms of the Taekwondo base, but even though she was fighting almost kind of like half guard down, I mean, her ability to protect her head was very, very impressive. And she would still take a couple shots, but even the time she was taking shots, she was almost always returning fire with an even more impressive kick or combination. She got held against the fence for a decent amount of the first round against Araujo, and as soon as she was able to break off, she landed this 5-strike combo that ended with opposite head kicks in stride. That was just, it's so impressive to see just kicks thrown and cast out like that at the end of what was a 3-punch combo punctuated by 2, not leg kicks or body kicks, but kicks to the head. Really rare diversity of striking that Silva demonstrated, along with the cardio to support it. I see, before when I was just kind of watching these casually without a betting angle in terms of Silva's appearances in recent years, because, I came into doing this, I started the MMA Rax account almost a month before her debut against Jasmine Jasudavicius. And even though I've enjoyed watching Silva's rise, I've still been kind of just doing it from a casual perspective where I haven't really had to worry about capping her skill set prior to this or anything. So a lot of the optimism that I saw from people around what her ceiling was, I was just thinking, you know what? She's got probably the best smile of any women's fighter in the UFC, and she's got a nice butt. So I can see why so many people like her. But actually watching, her put like the skill set that she has on the feet relative to the other women in her division and in women's MMA generally, I see why a lot of people think that she's a special talent. I don't quite know if she's going to be a champion because I think there's still a little bit of well-roundedness that leaves something desired, but she's fun. She is fun and she's easy to root for. And I think that I think her blend of defensive discipline with sophisticated striking is going to be enough to get her a decision over Grasso here. She got the Wonder Boy comparison when she fought Andrade, I think it was, from the UFC commentary team. But you know who she really reminds me of? Is Ian Gary. In terms of not only the ability to skirt the cage and weaponize cardio for 15 minutes, potentially even 25 minutes when she finally gets a 5-round fight, but the way that she's just able to cast up the kicks so quickly and effortlessly is really, really impressive stuff. And she's certainly more likable, I think, from the average MMA fan than Ian Gary is, even though I like Ian Gary more than most people. But I see a lot of the same skill set and effectiveness and comfort with fighting off the back foot that she has, that I think is going to serve her well against Grasso here. I think Grasso's probably going to pressure her into the fence, but Silva's already demonstrated she's comfortable fighting there. Grasso's going to try to get off 3-punch combos and maybe land some power shots, but I think Silva's just going to be too elusive, and it's going to frustrate Grasso too much, and the speed is just going to be too much for her to deal with. So I'll say Grasso maybe lands the more effective shots that make this maybe 1-1 going into the third, but I still think that Silva is just going to be too quick and too good. And I think she will handle fighting in the more uncomfortable moments for her better than Grasso will handle her own uncomfortable moments based on how she handled her uncomfortable moments in her recent appearances against Shevchenko. So give me Silva to win 29-28, unanimous decision. And again, I don't know what her ceiling is in terms of her being a future champion, but I certainly think she's proved that she deserves to be among the ranked in this division at this point, and I think she is going to be a problem for a lot of other women's MMA fighters just because of the style that she has and the defensive discipline that she employs. And she's only 28 years old, so there's still a long way to go in terms of her demonstrating other level ups in her skill set that are at the UFC level. It's crazy looking back at her run to get into the UFC because she had, she's got 7 submission wins in her MMA career, and 6 of them came consecutively before she got her fight with Jasudavicius. And she hasn't attempted a submission in the UFC yet. So she hasn't really had to show off whatever elements of her ground game are there yet. And you just wonder how well-rounded she can potentially be and what there's still left to demonstrate. I see why people have so much optimism in her now. And I'm on board with it. But not just because she's cute. She's pretty damn good. So Silva 29-28. The featured bout at UFC 315 is between Jose Aldo and Aiemann Zahabi. Aldo's 32-9, lost a controversial split decision to Mario Batista at UFC 307. I thankfully came out profitable that night because the judges gave the fight to Mario Batista. I honestly think it could have gone either way, but that fight shadows a problem with Jose Aldo that is one of the reasons why I feel good about staying away from this fight in general, that I'll get into in a second. But I also faded Aldo against a fighter that I have very much enjoyed capping and betting on in the past, in Jonathan Martinez. And even though that didn't affect my ability to profit on UFC 301, Martinez still had in terms of UFC career, might have been his worst showing, even worse against his fight against Davey Grant. And Aldo gave him a 30-27 in his return to the cage. And, just real quick, I do think it's very funny that looking back, I remember when Merab fought Aldo, and I think Merab was a pretty big favorite. He might not have been a big favorite, but I remember that the over was juiced to hell, and that's what I ended up picking on, and that cashed. But it was very funny looking back at how much hate Merab got in that fight because he wasn't able to take Aldo down, but still held him against the fence for what felt like all but like 2 minutes of the fight and won a 30-27 literally by just holding a guy against the fence. And it wasn't until the fight after that that all these Merab fans came out of the woodwork after what he did to Peter Yan because of how unbelievable the pace and style that he fights at is relative to deploying takedown attempts. It's funny that Batista got as much hate as he did for the way that he fought Aldo when Merab got forgiven for the way that he fought Aldo extremely quickly, in a way that has since kind of been memory hold. I just think it's a funny juxtaposition in results. Meanwhile, Zahabi is 12-2, had arguably a career best showing against Pedro Munoz at Fight Night Edmonton last year. I did take Munoz as an underdog, and that thankfully didn't affect my ability to profit on Fight Night Edmonton, but Munoz did end up dropping that one. I think it was a closer fight than people remember, but I don't think that there was any question that Zahabi ended up winning that if memory serves correct. And prior to that, got one of the biggest betting upsets of last year against Yavid Basharat. But that fight was also closer than people remember. Most people just remember it being a pretty substantial upset, and Zahabi, I think, pretty clearly winning the third round. But what I think a lot of people forget is that Basharat there wasn't a lot of damage in the second round. Basharat won the first round considerably, and then the second round was close, but it was only close because there wasn't a lot of damage that was done, and it was clear that Basharat was still winning the round up until like the last. It wasn't even the last minute. It was like a sequence in the last minute where Zahabi like hurt Basharat to where Basharat got staggered back a little bit, and that little bit of damage at the end of the round made enough of an impression that swung the round in Zahabi's favor. Zahabi was able to build off of that momentum to win the final round and then get a 29-28 comeback win over Basharat in that upset. But had he not gotten that little moment of damage at the end of the second round, he doesn't get that win over Basharat, and then you wonder how different the career trajectories of those two relative to what has happened since shakes out to be. So that has me a little bit hesitant because I've got this one graded like dead even. So, Aldo has since dipped back within the 200 range, back into the 100 range. He's now like 192 right now. So if I had a slight lean on Aldo, I would feel more comfortable betting him at that price than when he was in the 200 range earlier this week. But you just worry about this guy that fought for a lot of his best parts of his career at featherweight, having moved down to bantamweight now and been knocked out several times over the course of his very, very long MMA career. At some point, Father Time is going to come knocking, and that blend of attrition with having taken weight off of his chin is going to come back to get him. And I don't think Batista was the kind of power puncher that was going to take advantage of it. Jonathan Martinez wasn't going to do it. Merab Dvalishvili wasn't going to do it. Maybe Rob Font, maybe Pedro Munoz, maybe even Cheeto, but he was able to handle all three of those fights, and at that point he was still 33, 34 years old, certainly not 38 with the kind of layoff that he had between the Dvalishvili and Martinez fights. You worry it's going to break a lot of hearts of MMA fans if this guy shows up old at some point, and it could be in this spot. And Zahabi, I think he's easily the hardest hitter of the last, certainly more than the last three opponents that Aldo has fought. Go look at the Arichi Long fight if you don't believe me, because I believe that was the first time Arichi Long got knocked out, and it happened in less than 90 seconds. And Zahabi put him out bad. Like, Zahabi is a ferociously hard hitter. He just is. And he's also one of the most he has some of the most elite striking defense in the UFC. Like, to be in the 60s is already very, very good. High 60s is extremely good. Zahabi was, I think, 73% prior to his fight against Munoz. Munoz was able to make that dip a little bit. I think Munoz mostly kind of abandoned leg kicks against Zahabi, which is one of the reasons I was mad having bet him, was because, like, oh, this guy was a leg kick cheeser almost his whole career, and then he just kind of abandoned what was his signature weapon that almost got him a win over Sean O'Malley before that became a no contest. But in any event, Zahabi, the blend of defensive responsibility with the punching power makes me wonder if Aldo comes in and is just a little bit too slow on the reactions or whatever, even though it seems like he's continuing to defy Father Time. You just wonder how long he's going to be able to do it. And I just think there's too much risk either way between Aldo being an anomaly relative to his age and other forces that I've traditionally considered strong indicators for betting for or against. You know, taking weight off of your chin, moving down a weight class when you already have attrition, being a fighter at 38 years old generally, even though Zahabi is, I think, 37 in his own right, so age doesn't make as much of a difference in this matchup, although is still shown out against significantly younger opponents than him in his two most recent appearances against Batista and Jonathan Martinez. So he's defied odds in both of those cases to have close performances. Although defying that massive layoff that he had against Martinez too, where I don't think ring rust is really nearly as much of a factor here, but he's just continued to defy so many things that I traditionally use as judges of success or failure that I would just feel comfortable sitting back and observing. If I had to guess, if this fight wasn't in Canada, I would probably feel better. I think I would probably just take Aldo to win outright. But because this is a Canada spot, and I've said before, it feels like the UFC is trying to do right by the Canadian fight, all of the Canadian fighters on this card. I have to imagine that if this fight goes the distance, and it's overwhelmingly favored to do so, I think the over 2.5 is something like 370 or close to 400 or something. If this fight does go the distance, I have to imagine that the Canadian crowd and the judges are going to favor whatever moments of damage Zahabi is able to get on Aldo, rather than Aldo deploying kind of a consistent game plan of volume, even if he's not necessarily connecting a lot. He's just throwing more when they are exchanging at distance. So I'm going to take Zahabi to win a split decision here that's going to leave a lot of non-Canadian MMA fans pissed off and feeling like, you know, Aldo's been screwed in a lot of his most recent results, whether it be Dvalishvili holding him against the fence for as long as he did, or Batista holding him against the fence as long as he did. The last thing I want to mention here real quick is I can't recommend Jack Slack's podcasts enough. I listen to all of his recap shows. I don't listen to his boycast or subscribe to his content or whatever, but he does put out all of his recap shows for free, and I very much enjoy listening to those. He obviously very sophisticated technical analyst when it comes to MMA, much higher level than I think I can even hope to achieve, even though I think I'm pretty good at judging and predicting the results of fights in the sport in my own right at this point. But, you know, one thing that he talked about being such a historian is how Aldo has kind of always had this issue of just kind of believing he's winning fights when the other guy isn't really throwing strikes. And so that's why he's kind of always had this issue of not really knowing or putting a lot of effort into peeling himself off the fence, as much as just focusing on stuffing the takedown and kind of forcing a stalemate that he thinks he's going to kind of win by default. And that can be an issue if you're not as you get older and you don't, you may have the resistance and the willpower to stop the fight from going to the floor, but if you're not able to peel yourself off the fence, and you've had that problem in the past, that's something that's only going to get more problematic as you get older. I don't know if Zahabi is going to opt to clinch with him against the fence as much as maybe his last two, and probably even Martinez. That would have served him more well to try doing that in his own fight, even if the judges were probably going to give it to Aldo in Brazil anyway. But I don't know if Zahabi is going to necessarily do that. If he does, I think he's going to have success with it in a way that's going to leave Aldo frustrated and his fans even more so frustrated. So it's just really tough to get a read on this. That's why I've got it graded dead even. I would take the over. There's too much juice on it, so I'm just staying away. But in a fight that's in Canada, give me Zahabi to win by split decision. This fight were anywhere else, I'd probably be giving the split to Jose Aldo. The co-main event at UFC 315 is a women's flyweight title fight between challenger Manon Fiorot and one of my favorite MMA fighters, period, Valentina Shevchenko. Real quick, let me just get the records off here. Fiorot enters 12-1, last fought against Erin Blanchfield at UFC Fight Night Atlantic City last year, where she was kind of inexplicably the underdog, and Fiorot put on an absolutely dominant performance. And that was another fight, again, where I was thinking just Fiorot's going to be way too big for Blanchfield, and I can't believe that she's being disrespected like this. I think a lot of people just are emotionally betting Blanchfield because they think she's cute. And it's kind of what felt like happened. And Fiorot got a very, very dominant decision win. Conversely, Shevchenko is 24-4-1. As I mentioned in the breakdown for Silva Grasso, those ladies are coming off of the last fight of their trilogy in which Shevchenko was able to win her belt back. She perhaps should have done so in the second fight at the same time if she had not made two very boneheaded mistakes that led to the concession of her back in either of those fights. I think that she wins both of them pretty handily and still only has 3 losses and no draws on her record as opposed to 4 losses and a draw. All right, now I've gotten the record out of the way. Let me get my personal biases out of the way. I'm someone that for as long as I've casually paid attention to this sport, Shevchenko is one of the people that has drawn me in. Because it's one thing to be good. It's another thing to be dominant for as long as Shevchenko was over so many of the women she was fighting against, not named Amanda Nunes. I mean, and even going further than that, I just love hearing this woman talk. I wish she would do like a podcast or something after she retires, or that she would at least have one while she's in the late stages of her career. She's probably too content to, spend time at the gun range and stuff. Or, dance on Facebook Live next to her pool. But, I mean, when you hear this woman talk, and I know that she said this right before she lost to Grasso, but when you hear her talk and say things like, how can I push my limits as a mixed martial artist? How can I push my limits as a human being? That's really more what I'm striving to get out of myself than anything. I mean, this woman is just a competitor to the core. She will set, if she doesn't set your soul on fire, I mean, you just ain't living. I mean, she is everything that I love about this sport in terms of just being not only phenomenally talented and well-rounded, but it's what makes the two things that led to the 2 first results in that trilogy against Grasso all the more incredible and inexplicable, that someone as smart and sophisticated at making adjustments as Shevchenko would commit two of those mistakes that would lead to her losing her title and then not immediately getting it back in the first rematch. I mean, when this sport is really at its best, short of, somebody getting an incredible finish, it's two high-level, well-rounded competitors competing in violent chess with a belt on the line. And Shevchenko, for so much of her career, was a chess master in terms of having every tool in her belt available and making the decisions constantly to not only win rounds, but then dominate the fight as it wears on to where she would get a finish or where she would get a resounding decision. And yeah, has her dominance started to wane a little bit? Of course. A lot of people thought that she lost to Natalia Santos. The fight hasn't necessarily aged gracefully, given Santos not only popping for PEDs right before she was about to do the PFL tournament this year, but then also getting finished by Dakota Ditcheva in PFL, who a lot of people think is probably the pound-for-pound best women's MMA fighter generally right now. And then obviously, the mistakes that she made against Grasso do kind of show that she is slipping a little bit, I think. At the same time, she's coming off of her best performance out of the set of three, where she really, she was, I don't want to say she was humble in defeat the first time she lost to Grasso, but I think she at least recognized that she was going to have to put forth a better effort, that she wasn't just going to be this, assumed dominant force that even the betting market thought she was going to be going into the first Grasso fight. Then she felt like she won the second fight. I felt like she won the second fight. Regardless of whether you feel like she should have or shouldn't have won the second fight, she should have won the second fight on the principle of there's no way you can score that fifth round a 10-8. And the judge that did ended up forcing a split draw as a result. And if that judge still scores that round for Grasso as a 10-9, that judge is still scoring the fight in favor of Shevchenko, and she gets her belt back by split decision. She came out of that pissed off, feeling like that she had gotten wronged in that fight, and she responded the way that you want to see an all-time great champion respond. She not only got her belt back, she dominated in the third fight at a UFC Noche event where it felt like the whole world was rooting for Grasso, where the betting market expected Grasso to get her belt back. I don't know how many more of those performances she has in her at 37 years old. But it helps that she's fighting an opponent in Fiorot who is, 35 herself. Granted, is coming in with significantly less attrition, but also significantly less UFC experience and a significantly less well-rounded skill set. I don't want to say significantly, but certainly a less well-rounded skill set. Now, this is still going to be, I think, a considerable challenge for Shevchenko because, Fiorot was massive compared to Blanchfield. She's bigger than Shevchenko here, too. Not considerably so. In fact, Shevchenko actually is going to have the reach advantage in this. Not a significant one, only 1.5 inches, but I think that's something that is still interesting to consider here because there's a lot of people saying, oh, she's going to have 2 inches of height. It doesn't matter. Not only is that not a significant height discrepancy, it's even less significant considering Shevchenko is the one that actually has the longer reach. But even though Fiorot's taller, I don't necessarily think she's going to massively impose her size on Shevchenko the way that she was able to do against someone like Blanchfield. I do think that the longer this stays in the standing exchanges, that Fiorot is probably going to get the better of Shevchenko. Both of these women are exceptionally defensively disciplined in the striking defense. Fiorot maybe just a little bit more so, but not, considerably more than Shevchenko. Both of them are pretty solid overall. There's people saying, "Oh, her chin's starting to go because Grasso knocked her down in the second round in the second fight." But that happened in I think it happened in the first round of both their first two fights. Certainly, at least one of them. I think it definitely happened in the first, but it's not like Valentina got knocked down and then had to like fight from her back and didn't get up or something. She got knocked down and then immediately rolled back to her feet and got up, and it was just like, she got caught and then was back up, and it wasn't like she was wobbled or anything. And she was able to get Grasso back a few times herself, even though she never knocked her down. But I'm not concerned about Shevchenko. I mean, Shevchenko's been knocked out once, and it was a retirement TKO against Liz Caramouche all the way back in like 2010. So if Fiorot had a more well-rounded skill set to where she would threaten a takedown more often against Shevchenko and kind of impose her size and threaten a submission against Valentina, then I would be more concerned about the finishing upside for Fiorot here. But Fiorot doesn't have any MMA submission wins. She's got an absent submission game. So I think it's much more likely that she's just going to try to keep this a straight-up boxing match for 25 minutes. Whereas Shevchenko has... It's one thing, like... as I said, I expect Fiorot to get the better of her in the striking. But her coming forward and Valentina kind of building her whole game off of landing very effective counters. The other element of her putting the counters in is that she may be better than almost any other fighter that I've seen in recent memory. Is just so good at timing when to shoot. And it's when you're, and it's one thing, you see so many fighters that have to just work and grind relentlessly just to get the fight to the ground, to the point that when they finally get the fight to the ground after working so hard for the takedown, they don't have the continued stamina left to hold their opponent down and make enough of an impression with ground and pound after that to where getting the takedown was even worth all the work that it took to take it. The best takedowns you can always get are the ones that are just timed perfectly. And Shevchenko's timing on her entries is brilliant. It is what makes her so tactically phenomenal. And that was still showing up in every single appearance against Grasso, even the one she lost, even the one that went to draw, and most certainly in the one that she just dominated, where she controlled the fight for over 15 minutes. Over 3 of the 5 total rounds of time in that fight were spent in her control. Do I expect Fiorot to be more resistant, not only in terms of getting to her feet, but also resisting the takedowns outright than Grasso was? Certainly. But I also don't know if Fiorot has faced this credible of a wrestling threat in any of her previous appearances the way that she's going to get it from Shevchenko. I think that Shevchenko... I don't see any reason why Shevchenko isn't going to be able to time her entries as well as she has in any of her previous fights against any of her other opponents. I do think this is going to be a close fight, because I think that there probably will be some rounds that say standing longer than Shevchenko likes, to where Fiorot is able to get better of her for long enough on the feet that she is clearly the winner of the rounds. But Shevchenko is just too savvy and too experienced and too tactically brilliant in more ways than one, that more often than not reward the smart fighters with those well-rounded skill sets, to where I can't imagine that she's not going to get a 48-47 decision here, at least. So I will say that Fiorot gets 2 of the rounds. Maybe one of the early rounds, as Valentina gave up the first round of her first fight against Grasso, and then maybe gives up one of the championship rounds as Fiorot is able to kind of get a better sense of when the entries are coming and is able to be more resistant, maybe it comes down to the 5th round and it's 2-2 going into 5. But at that point, I think the championship experience is going to show up for Shevchenko. And I don't expect Fiorot to have a well-rounded enough game to where she's able to exploit the weaknesses of Valentina the way that Grasso was. Because Grasso had a submission win before she choked out Shevchenko. Even though she's kind of just known as a pure boxer, at the end of the day, she still has, I think, a more well-rounded skill set than Fiorot does, even though she lands almost a third of as many takedowns. She still has a better submission game than anything Fiorot has demonstrated. We know what Fiorot wants to do. She's going to want to make this a pure striking affair. And I think for probably about 10 of the 25 minutes of this fight, she'll be able to do that. But I think Valentina is going to be too savvy about putting this where she knows she's going to be the more battle-tested and proven fighter, to where she's not able to have to worry as much about getting exploited on the feet. She's just too savvy. She's Chevy Chonks. She's one of the best to ever do this. And I hope she fights Zhang Weili before it's all said and done, but, well, that remains to be seen. I'm kind of surprised she's the underdog, but I also understand because the hype on Fiorot after the Blanchfield result is pretty crazy, and there were a lot of people that were fading her against Grasso. But I also think a lot of people, I know there's a lot of people that watch this sport that are just kind of sick of her and want to see her lose. That ain't me. It's not. I won't be upset with either of these women winning because I think both of them are really, really phenomenally talented. But one of these women is really phenomenally talented, and the other woman is really phenomenally talented and has proven herself already to be one of the all-time greats in women's mixed martial arts. And I think she's got at least one more in her. And at plus money, I'm willing to ride with it. This is only the second women's underdog I have put out this year since I started doing this. I am 1-0 so far. I took Aiemann Perez to beat, I think it was Carol Rosa. I think it was UFC 312. Might have been 311, 312. It was one of the cards earlier this year. That is the only women's underdog I've taken so far. Here goes number 2. And I'm just over 50% lifetime with the men's underdogs and plus money on over-under hedges, all that into consideration. So I usually go at least 1 for 2. We'll see if I can go 2-0 here. But give me Shevchenko, 48-47, unanimous decision. And we'll see what they do with her after this. I hope they give her Zhang Weili. Because what a fight that would be to determine who's number 2 all time behind Amanda Nunes. I know they don't like doing champ versus champ fights anymore, which is why Topuria kind of had to vacate to go up to lightweight, but what a fight that would be between Shevchenko and Weili if they were both champions. I won't be upset if Fiorot wins the belt, though, especially in front of the French-Canadian fans. That'd be cool to see. But even removing my bias and admiration for what Shevchenko has done and what she's capable of and who she is, I still think she's got one more in her here. So give me Chevy Chonks, 48-47, and still. And now we come to the main event. Belal, remember the name, Muhammad, and Jack Della Maddalena. Muhammad enters 24-3, won the welterweight title over Leon Edwards in Edwards' backyard of London at UFC 304. I went, I think, 4-0 on underdogs that night. Could have gone 5-0, but chickened out of the Jake Hadley-Callan Loughran fight after Hadley missed weight. But I did take Belal as the biggest underdog of the bunch, and he won, I thought, what was a pretty clear 48-47. Could have been a 49-46, but I think you still got to give Leon that last round after. I think he elbowed Edwards open on the ground, but still thought it was 1-2 for Muhammad. I thought it was very, very funny and classic. I mean, Bisping and DC, it feels like those guys go back and forth all the time in terms of who's the worst UFC commentator, but DC at least gives you a little bit of hints of wrestling analysis when the fight steers into that realm that is somewhat valuable. Bisping doesn't give you anything. And when a UK fighter is on and he's just transparently biased, him trying to make a case for Edwards winning that fight at the end, and then Anik just straight up telling him, I think it was pretty clearly 1-2-4 at the very least for Muhammad. It was just elite comedy. Like it was one of the most transparently obvious instances in a long list of many that Bisping has had in terms of him just not being able to separate bias when doing his job. It was absolutely ridiculous. In any event, great performance from Muhammad. A shame that he didn't get to fight Shavkat Rakhmonov, but he's getting an intriguing matchup here against Della Maddalena, who's 17-2 and was on his way to losing to Gilbert Burns, who I picked to beat him as an underdog at UFC 299. Two of the judges had the fight scored 2018 for Gilbert. Gilbert might have even been on his way to winning a 30-27, but Della Maddalena pulled off a great scramble within the last 2 minutes of the fight and was able to get a knee against Burns was more compromised at that point for the amount of effort he exerted trying to keep the fight on the ground, that when he got up, Della Maddalena finally got him with a knee and was able to get the knockout. And, good comeback win for him, but in a fight he was favored to win, certainly didn't perform to price. I believe I have told this story before, but Della Maddalena is somebody that I have been fading for a long time with little to no success. One of the things that inspired me to start doing this analysis, in the times that I've told this story before was, I would routinely watch the pay-per-views and particularly the main cards, and I would just kind of, parlay all of the fighters that I would look at the Fight Center on ESPN, and I would just kind of take a glance at the matchup and say, I think this guy's going to win or this guy's going to win, and then take the winner. And I would always just be like one guy off. And my thinking was, okay, if I ever actually put any thought into, if I actually looked at these in extended capacity instead of just winging it, how good could I really be at this? Well, at UFC 270, I was still winging it, and I couldn't believe that Francis was the underdog gone, so I took Francis as an underdog, but I wanted to get one other underdog that was fighting somewhere on the card. And so I remember just kind of Googling picks for UFC 270, and this is one of the things that inspired me to, create a platform with substantive betting analysis that people could turn to for reliable advice. Because I remember reading some totally random website that sold me on Pete Rodriguez beating Jack Della Maddalena. And so I played that. And I watched that ticket go up in flames pretty quickly that night while I proceeded to hit every other pick that I made for that card. Thinking, oh my God, I can't believe I just took Pete Rodriguez, who got smoked, on the whim of some total random opinion that I read on the internet. What the hell was I thinking? And how is there not more reliable sources for betting advice than what I just came across? A month later, I was running the analysis, and 3 months after that, I had started MMA Rax. But I faded Jack Della Maddalena against Pete Rodriguez, and boy did I feel foolish. I did make him a parlay leg at UFC 275 against Ramazan Ameev. He was one of the best picks I made that night. I might have stayed away when he fought Danny Roberts. I can't quite remember. It's possible I may have taken the over in that one. I do think I took the over when he fought Randy Brown. That fight, obviously, that's a win for him that I think might have aged better than honestly any other win that he's had during his UFC career, especially the style in which he did it. But the Basil Hafez fight, I thought Hafez should have won, frankly. I know all the people that claim damage over position will say that Hafez should have lost, but I was still kind of surprised that Della Maddalena got the decision there. I thought Hafez made enough of an impact on the ground to win that fight, and I was surprised, frankly, that that fight gave me caution going forward in terms of even though a lot of people were willing to make excuses for Della Maddalena having to cut weight twice in a week or whatever, I still thought that this guy is a low-level enough opponent that it really shouldn't have been as close as it was relative to the guys that we've seen Della Maddalena beat in the past. The Kevin Holland fight, I mean, I picked Holland to win as an underdog. The fight was a split decision. I remember watching that fight feeling like I was kind of going to need to get a robbery if Holland won. But what has surprised me is that there's a lot of people that I've heard that scored that fight for Holland more than I would have guessed. So that is a fight that possibly, I'd need to watch again in order to get a better sense of Holland having it closer or not. But as someone that bet on Holland, I felt like Della Maddalena probably won 29-28. But he showed enough concerns in the Hafez fight that I felt very comfortable playing Gilbert Burns as a local underdog against Della Maddalena at $2.99 last year, and that looked like a great bet up until the last 2 minutes of the fight. Because I think I agree with two of the judges that Burns was up 2018. The fight was at least 19-19 on one other judge's scorecard going into the final round, and I think Burns was going to win up until Maddalena had that savvy scramble to get out, get back to the feet, and then had the urgency, maybe kind of understanding that he needed a finish to go finish that fight in the last 2 minutes and finish Burns. So, he deserves credit for that. But that fight proved that the concerns that people had for his ground game against Hafez were very much validated by how Burns was able to exploit them as well. You don't think a guy like Belal Muhammad is going to be able to take advantage of those? That's really what it comes down to for me here. A lot of times in fights these high-level championship fights that people perceive to be close, and Belal Muhammad, I think this was a close fight when the lines came out. Muhammad blew out to like a 200 favor, and now he's, there's late money coming in on Della Maddalena just because I think there's a lot of people that are just spite betting Muhammad. And there's a lot of people that are enamored with Della Maddalena just because he wants to strike all the time. And there's the age gap to consider here too. I don't deny that that's very significant. Probably feel good about betting on a younger underdog when the other guy's on the other side of 36, given the record that fighters at welterweight or below have that are for champions that are 35 and older. But we've seen Muhammad buck that trend himself when he won the title. I don't know if that's for fighters in championship fights generally or fighters defending their title. But we just saw Volk get his belt back too against a younger opponent at 145. So it's, it's been a good trend for a while, but lately there's been some, pushback on it a little bit. And I think that's probably going to end up being the case here too. But the point I wanted to make is that a lot of times in these fights that are perceived to be close, I think the question you have to ask yourself, especially for fights that are going to be 5 rounds instead of 3, is when you're comparing a striker versus grappler matchup like this one is perceived to be, is the wider gap between the two fighters in the striking or the grappling? And I think you would be hard-pressed to argue that Belal Muhammad doesn't have more for Della Maddalena on the feet, particularly coming off of the performance he had against Leon Edwards, than Della Maddalena has for Muhammad on the ground. So I think this is pretty clearly going to be Muhammad's fight. It's possible he has to endure some early adversity. He's been knocked out in the first round before, but it only happened once. But on the flip side, Della Maddalena's only had to go the distance 3 times in his MMA career. And I don't believe this is going to be the first time he's ever had to go 5 rounds. And even though he's had 2 strong third-round showings in a close fight against Hafez, and even though I think that might have ended up being the swing round, he's still, he conceded a bad takedown that I think made that round end up close, but he, coming off of the second weight cut and dropping, I think it was the first round to Hafez, he wasn't gassed enough that he didn't have enough left to where he couldn't make a strong enough impression to win that fight. And then obviously, even though he was about to lose the Burns fight, he still had enough left in the tank to get back to his feet and find a finish in that instance. Those were still 15-minute fights, not 25-minute fights. And we know that at this point, Belal is a guy that is built to thrive in 5-round fights. And not just thrive in 5-round fights, but thrive in fights that go the distance generally. He has almost 7 times as much experience going the distance here as Della Maddalena does. That is unbelievable. That is unreal difference there. So the longer this one goes, the more I think it's going to start to gradually favor Muhammad. And even though Maddalena has above average takedown defense, I can't imagine it's going to be good enough to where it's going to keep Muhammad from putting this fight where he knows he's going to be most effective. And he'll work to get to the back. And when he takes the back, he'll keep that fight in back control for, I think, at least 3 rounds, much in the same way as he did in his most effective rounds against Leon Edwards. So I'm going to take Muhammad to win a 49-46 decision here. Could be 48-47. I will be surprised, though, if Della Maddalena wins, just because, not only have I been fading this guy both blindly from even before I started doing this while actually putting in the work to pay attention to it, and both after I've put in considerable work trying to chase the fade on this guy, Della Maddalena. As good of a striker as he is, I think it's important to recognize that, he's coming off of 3 very, very close results, all of which he could have arguably lost, certainly one of which he was on his way to losing before he kind of pulled a finish out of his butt. And he wouldn't even be getting the title shot here if it wasn't for Rakhmonov suffering an injury and just circumstance dictating that a guy like Sean Brady, who got finished by Belal, not get an immediate title shot against Muhammad while he's got the belt. So I think Della Maddalena during his UFC run has had a lot of good bounces his way on his way to getting to this point. But I think his luck is about to run out here. And it's possible he could still be champion one day. He's still only 28 years old, and he might get a better matchup than this one going forward. And, in 2 years, he'll be 30, and Belal will be 38. And who knows if Belal is still fighting at the same effective pace with the same style 2 years from now as he is right now. But at this moment, he's champ for a reason. And he's on quite a run of his own. And I don't see any reason why an opponent that doesn't have the kind of well-rounded skill set and has demonstrated vulnerableness in the areas that Muhammad knows are going to be right for exploitation. Even as Muhammad has said this week, I'm going to show him Canelo hands and whatever. You should know by this point you can't really take a braggadocious interview from a UFC fighter seriously in the lead up to a fight. I think the holes are pretty clearly there for Muhammad to exploit, where he's able to get at minimum a 48-47, but I'm going to go further and say it's a 49-46. So give me Belal to reign and still, both champions to be and still at this card, to the chagrin of many longtime UFC viewers that not only have some sort of dislike for Shevchenko, but also Belal's got to be, I mean, one of the most despised champions in recent memory. And I got to say, as somebody that's sided with him in a lot of his fights, I don't really get it. He may not be the most entertaining fighter in the world, but you love guys that deploy consistently effective game plans because they're very, very fun to bet on. And I didn't know if I was going to make him a leg at 200, but as this price has come down, it's really hard for me to ignore what he's shown success in relative to where Maddalena has shown weaknesses in and not take that price. So I still got to think about who I'm going to make my legs at for this card, but I do feel pretty good about this result, and I've obviously had a lot of really good success with not only main events generally this year, last week notwithstanding, but pay-per-view main events generally for a long time now. So I feel pretty good about Muhammad, and I'm going to be taking him to win. Give me Belal Muhammad, 49-46 unanimous decision. And that is going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 315. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe, follow on Twitter and YouTube. I can't thank you guys enough for helping me get to 2K before I hit my 3-year anniversary. I already thanked you profusely for it in the beginning, but I'm so grateful for it. Once again, it's been fun, and there's so many more good times ahead of this one. I promise you. We're still 3.5 years off of this being the even more incredible success and thriving platform that I think it can be, and that I can put the resources into to make sure it succeeds. And I'm looking forward to see where it goes. And I'm just going to keep building experience, analyzing and betting on this sport until then, and just keep getting sharper and sharper and putting out the best reads that I can for free the whole time and in the future. So thank you very much. We will be back for UFC 316, which is, at the moment, Merab Dvalishvili versus Sean O'Malley 2. It'll be interesting to see which way I go with that, given I picked O'Malley last time. I don't necessarily know how much has changed between the last matchup to where I would feel any less good about O'Malley, but maybe I'll feel better about Merab, or maybe I'll just hedge on the over. But we'll see where it goes. I'm probably more looking forward to the Kayla Harrison-Pena fight, just because Kayla Harrison's an Ohio girl. If you know one of my other gigs from this, you know how important Ohio sports are to me. And Kayla, being an Ohio native, seeing her beat the ultimate heel in women's MMA in Juliana Pena, I hope that she absolutely dominates her, and it motivates Amanda Nunes to come out of retirement for what would be an incredible super fight between those two women. So that could be the second straight card where I'm low-key looking more forward to the women's title fight than the men's title fight. But that card, honestly, just looking overall so much more impressive, even as it's only like halfway booked, it looks like at this point, than what this card kind of has to offer in some respects. I think I probably went over a little bit over 2 hours, but I still think I did, reasonably better in terms of speeding through these than I did last episode. But in any event, thank you very much for sitting with me through this, and we'll be back for UFC 316 in about a month. Until then, take care. Good luck this weekend, and yeah, bye.